Hello, welcome to this episode today. Okay, let's talk about something that is quite difficult to talk about, but at the same time, it's critical to talk about suicide, right? It's difficult, but it's critical for us to address specifically the language that we use when we're talking about suicide. I find this particular phrase, it's been around for ages, but I find it very disturbing. I find it very challenging because it connects a very different message after death of someone by suicide. And that phrase is committed suicide. I mean, you've heard this, you've seen it in the news, you've seen it as headline, you've seen it with your friends talking about a loved one who's passed on by suicide. Have you ever stopped to consider what that wording implies? Committed suicide. You see, the word committed is often used with like crimes, right? Sin, if you're religious, or murder, all right? Robbery, committed a crime. It connects a crime. It's often tied with crime. That's what that word stands for. And historically, I mean, even in some region of the world right now, some countries still practice some punishment. Some countries consider suicide as a crime, and that also impacts on us not having a clear record or clear incident. Because historically as well, this has been something that's been around for ages. Although some we've moved on, or we claim to move on from this, that phrase is still lingering. That phrase still leads to unintentional consequences, like blame, like judgment, like stigma. The thing is that even death by suicide is a painful experience, it's a tragedy, it's not a crime. And of all the words they use to capture this tragedy, committed suicide is the list of them. But I'm not making this video to make a fuss about language, because suicide is a big thing beyond the vocabulary we use to define it, to describe it. But there is something around that vocabulary, there's something around that phrase that can be an eye-opener for us to initiate other conversation, to look within our system, to identify, get to the root causes of suicide. There is something within that phrase that could provide like a leeway, like a window for us to step back a little bit and ask ourselves some crucial question. And that's what this episode, this video is all about. That's what this, conversation is all about. And I believe we have to talk about it. Besides the fact that suicide by itself is very painful, it's a loss. Every now and then, whenever we experience death by suicide, the families, the loved ones, the relatives they are grappled with profound loss, and they have so many unanswered questions. And the phrase committed suicide adds to this pain. The phrase, committed suicide merely contribute to their difficulty because it connects judgment, blame. It adds to their stigma. It is an impression that someone has done something wrong. If I'm telling you that vocabulary isn't the best of it, what other alternative is there? How can we capture this conversation? How can we capture this tragedy? Because defining it and describing it as a crime is a list of it. It's not, it's far from it. It is a tragedy. And so what word, what vocabulary, how do we capture this in our conversation? But before I tell you that, let's look at some of the very interesting statistics, which is according to the Oxford Textbook of Psychiatry. And it notes that only 25 to 30% of suicide are accompanied by a note. And so what that means is that the family are always left with so much questions to answer. They are always, worried about, did I do something wrong? What happened? It takes them by surprise most of the time. In some time, the note can mention, what the feeling they were going through. It can talk about, they were having tough time, depression. But other times, it doesn't mention anything about suicide. And so it takes the family by surprise. It takes years. Most time, they don't get over that scenario. It's a tragedy. And so the word committed suicide doesn't capture this tragedy. It does a whole lot of the opposite. All right. And it's counterproductive because it still doesn't address the root causes. It still doesn't lead us to finding out what could have gone wrong, because every time we use the word committed. It suggests wrongdoing instead of acknowledging the complexity of what this individual who has died by suicide was going through. It connotes a sense of individual responsibility, because if I say, oh, Anthony has committed, this crime, it is centering that responsibility of my action on myself. It means that I have made that choice. All right. I have made that decision to commit this crime, but that is far from it from suicide. This tragedy is not because people who die by suicide don't want to be here anymore. No, that's far from it. That decision is not because of that's what they want, but it's because there are other responsibilities, there are other things that has happened, which we're going to talk about. And so that phrase absorbs that responsibility away from the other systems, structures in society that is responsible for this incident. It is shifting out the focus away from the important things that we should be talking about whenever this tragedy has occurred. And for years, I believe we've not really had this conversation. Maybe it's been coming up in recent time, but imagine how long we've been using that phrase, committed suicide. Imagine how long we have not been focusing on the right thing, which is what has caused this tragedy. How do we stop it from happening? Rather than, oh, that was his choice, that was what he wanted to do. No, it's far from it. Far from it. I'm coming up with this idea in a suggestion that the phrase is not the right one. The committed suicide isn't the right phrase. What should be the better alternative if whenever these incidents happen? My dream, my hope is that it doesn't happen. But whenever it should happen, whenever you hear of someone who had passed on by suicide, how do we capture this conversation? How do we have this discourse in a way that is a lot more neutral? If you have to, maybe he died by suicide or he has ended his life. That suggests a lot more of compassion and free of blame, and it creates room for understanding than condemnation, because my dream is for us to, from this point in time, move forward to get to the root cause so that we can stop this incident from happening. My dream is this conversation, the goal of this conversation is that how can we get there just at the right time so that we could just stop that process from happening. That wouldn't happen if we keep on still thinking or working with the consciousness that it is an individual responsibility. No, it's not. There are other systems that has to come in place for us to really get to the root cause to address the incidents of this tragedy. All right, so now that I've been able to establish that that phrase is problematic, all right, here's a question now. What is the better alternative? What language is more neutral? That would focus on the tragedy without placing judgment. Let's be real. Whenever someone dies by suicide, there is different level of grief. Bereavement is a loss to the family. Someone's life has gone. Someone has chosen to leave this realm of reality, and it's painful on a different level. At work, colleagues, friends. But there's another level of pain that lingers, and that is the pain of the bereavement of suicide. Look, this is a lot more different from the bereavement of illness, bereavement of maybe a car accident. I mean, all that is painful. I've lost a loved one, and I know what that feels like, right? When I lost my father, it was still painful. But we could attribute it to a particular thing. We could attribute it to, okay, he was ill briefly and he passed on. That for me and for my family, it was a little bit of, it was painful, so painful. But at some point we could nip it at something. This is what happened. And I tell you what, you have no idea of how relieving during the process of us trying to process this event, the death, the loss, that piece of equation is so helpful in how we process that, our grief, and how we handle it. But evidence within the discourse of bereavement and suicide is so different, because there is a piece of an equation that is missing, which is why, what caused it. That piece of equation is what makes this tragedy so difficult to handle. Most people don't move on from it. Most people can't even move on from it. They keep on answering the question, why? What happened? Was it my fault? Did I do something wrong? Was I not a good parent? Was I not a good sister or a good sibling? that piece of equation is a part that is so painful. Coupled with that particular complexity of that trauma, and also the complexity of the difficulty of what the individual was going through, using this phrase again, committed suicide, doesn't do any good. Rather, it adds to that struggle, it adds blame, it adds judgment, it adds stigma to it. Stigma also from what the family will have to deal with. They could stigmatize themselves as that family that was not caring enough, or that was not loving enough, and so their loved one decided to take their life. And so you could see with me that this phrase, on one hand, is not helping us get to the root cause of the problem. On the second hand, is even causing another layer of difficulty to the family or the loved one of the demise. And so it is not helpful at all. But how can we really understand what suicide is? What is it that happens from the point of the individual? So I mentioned the statistics that from the Oxford the Handbook of Psychiatry that talks about that only 25 to 30% of incidents of suicide are left with a note. And so there's a whole lot of void that's happening, and the family doesn't even know what is going on. The blame, the unknown, the bereavement is so difficult. How can we really understand what is it that really happens? I decided to look at the societal causes, and this is one of the things to also talk about why we have to move away from the phrase committed suicide, is because it still puts the blame on the individual, and it becomes blinded towards the system, the structures in society, the societal causes, the social causes that is responsible for this tragedy. When I was going through research material I could get, there was something that stood out for me. The social, in terms of the social causes of suicide, or the societal contributing factors to this tragedy, it was the idea that this was an attempt to move away from something. This was in their own context. Let's be real, all right? If you look at life as an individualized project that is shaped by our unique circumstances, you understand that, and you could see that suicide is a response to a challenge that feels insurmountable. And that's one of the things that stands out. That was a common theme about this analogy. If you are afraid of public speaking, what do? You avoid it, right? You do everything possible to avoid it. If you have phobia for spider, and you came into this room, this podcast room, all right, don't worry. This is my best studio. It's going to be the best studio in the world, right? Anyway, but at the moment, this podcast room, right? And you saw a spider. What are you going to do? You might literally not even step into this room ever. It could even lead to you screaming and having a very vivid physiological response because you've seen something that you're scared of. And so if you have phobias like that, you avoid the trigger, every form of it. In extreme cases, suicide becomes an ultimate form of avoidance. And this is what I stand out across reviewing the notes, making research on social causes of mental illnesses, reviewing this conversation around suicide. In extreme cases, suicide is a form of an ultimate avoidance. It is an attempt, it is a way of escaping an unbearable pain, hopelessness, isolation. And if you start to understand it from this point of view, I believe it opens up a lot of opportunity for us to get to the root cause and to make effort to prevent, educate, and be able to salvage a situation. If you can get people to understand that whenever you feel this way, understand that it is you making an attempt to avoid an unbearable pain, isolation, hopelessness, is a way of escape. And if that is the way I'm seeing it, what could be a better way? How can I nip this and say, okay, I've thought about this in this way, what could be the better way? That gives us a window of opportunity. It gives room for us to look at what are those causes of the unbearable pain. What are those things that is causing hopelessness? And how can we address the isolation that is making this individual to avoid, to escape from it? Suicide isn't about an individual giving up on their life. And so it's not a way of giving up, but it is about escaping a reality that feels unlivable. That's one theme that stands out. And that was far from the opposite of how we captured it. It was far from the phrase of committed suicide. It wasn't. It was a way of escape. And how can we help people from not using that way of that method of escape? What can we do? We shouldn't describe it as a crime, because that is reducing. That is not helping us to explore the prevention. That is not helping us to see what other societal structures, events, what other system that is contributing to this tragedy. Going back to that analogy of, if you have a phobia, you avoid. Why is it important? It is important because I believe that this opens up that conversation for us to ask, what are those things that an individual would avoid in such a magnitude of ending his reality? And since it's an avoidance, I believe that it opens up a window of opportunity for us to explore the prevention and for more understanding. If we see it as a form of avoidance, it becomes a lot more easier for us to understand the processes that goes on, like every other avoidance, and to really understand it and to prevent it. If I am avoiding hopelessness, it gives me that opportunity for me to find out what are the other best way of handling hopelessness rather than trying to escape hopelessness. If I am avoiding isolation, it gives me, if I understand from this point of view, it gives us that opportunity for us to find out what is the best way that I could experience and expose myself to isolation rather than escaping isolation. If I am avoiding and experiencing intense pain from bullying, it gives me that opportunity for us to find out what could be the best way for me to experience this pain of bullying rather than avoiding bullying, while at the same time allowing us to address the root cause of bullying at its first place, the root cause of isolation, the root cause of hopelessness. Here are some of the important shifts in perspective, because every time we use the word committed suicide, it doesn't give us the window and the opportunity for us to ask the right questions. It doesn't allow us to take a step back and really ask some crucial, deep question, which is, and I believe that this perspective of seeing suicide as an ultimate avoidant, it gives us that opportunity for us to ask crucial questions. Like, instead of us asking, why did he commit suicide? Which is what we tend to ask when we use the narrative of he committed suicide. We ask the question, oh, why did he commit suicide? And that you could hear from that narrative that it centers on the individual, which is far from what happens in this tragedy. Very myopic question. For lack of better word, it's a very close-ended question. All right, it doesn't open up windows of opportunity for us to look at other causes. What could have gone wrong? Instead of asking that question, this perspective of seeing suicide as an ultimate avoidant, it gives us the opportunity for us to be asking the right questions, which is, what was he trying to avoid? Was he avoiding the pain of repeated bullying? Was he avoiding the pain of isolation? Was he avoiding the pain of hopelessness or believing that things would never get better? Was it avoiding the deep pains of not being enough? If you start from the first one, which is, what was he trying to avoid? As opposed to, why did he commit suicide? You could hear that what was he trying to avoid opens up an entire window for us to find out those things that were a contributing factor to this tragedy. And here's the deal. When we ask the right questions, such as, what did he avoid? What did they avoid? And how can we as a society eliminate, reduce those things, or perhaps help others to face those things? By asking these questions, we start to uncover the root causes of suicide, and more importantly, open the door for us to, an opportunity for us to address those root causes, which we will never have if we just kept to the narrative of, oh, he committed suicide. The truth is, reducing the rate of suicide isn't just a medical problem, which is what this narrative of he committed suicide normally does. Makes it become one layer of problem Meanwhile, reducing the rate of road suicide, that's the truth. It's not just a medical problem. It's not just one system that's responsible for it. It's not just the family that's responsible for it. It is a collective task, a responsibility that we all share. The educational system, the educational institution must step up to stop or prevent bullying. The communities have to work together to reduce isolation and foster belonging. The mental health services have to work together to address the feeling of hopelessness and despair. Our social system needs to come in place to make sure that everyone feels valued and supported. Social justice system, all of this has to come together. The media. And here's the deal. This isn't just about us preventing suicide. It is about building a world where everyone could feel they have the tools to face life challenges, the thing that they are avoiding, no matter how hard they may seem. And all of this system has to come in place. The community, the educational institution, addressing bullying, hopelessness, addressing sense of belonging, the despair of hopelessness. All of this has to come together. It is never going to be one institutional challenge. It doesn't boil down to the family. You could have a loving family who support their children, does everything for them, but he gets to school and is being bullied constantly. You could have a loving partner, but gets to work and is being treated as a piece of shit and trash. So it is a collective. We have a responsibility to work together to reduce this tragedy. Think about this. Changing how we talk about suicide is just the beginning. Using the phrase committed suicide has really shifted our attention from looking at the root causes of suicide. It has shifted that responsibility and added different layers of stigma, blame, judgment in the different complexity that the families of the loved one who have died by suicide have to deal with. And so let's start using the language that opens up the conversation instead of shutting it down. Let's replace committed suicide with something more compassionate. I believe that we will never have to worry about whether it's compassionate or not. I believe at some point we'll come to the point where we have zero level of suicide, because it's such a very painful tragedy. Let's start asking the right question. What were they avoiding? And most importantly, let's create a world where people could feel supported before they ever consider avoiding life. It starts with your words and being kind. Remember, it is our collective responsibility for us to work together to stop this tragedy. No one have to feel that they have to avoid life to the point of exiting their reality. Thank you for joining me today on Reset with Dr. Anthony. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out to all the local national resources, Samaritan Crisis, GP. Please reach out. You are not alone. You've got this. See you next episode.